Continuing our coverage of Red Typhoon, and before we begin turn 5, we have to make a correction to a combat situation in turn 4. Here I did not take into account the defending unit's isolation status. That would have been a +1 die roll modifier. The correct result would have been defender retreats 1, and that would cause the elimination of the defending German unit. But the Russian unit that was eliminated actually survives, and now we will return it to play. So we return this eliminated unit, and we'll place it here together with this Soviet armored unit, 2 hexes southeast of Kirov. Now we move on to turn 5. The Soviets receive 7 activation points, the Germans 5. The Soviets will receive a partisan unit, and they may conduct an airdrop in this turn. We proceed now and start with the Soviet activation point phase. The Soviets didn't have any activation points left from their previous turn, so they only have 7 to spend in this one. On to the Soviet movement phase. Let's take a look at the situation on the board. And let's see the situation from south to north. Here we see the forces of the B or Bryansk front, and I think I figured out what the letters mean. Bryansk, B. Bryansk front in this game exists basically to guard the left flank of the WL front. Now, WL, I believe, means Western Front, left side of the Western Front, because you have WR units which are the right side. And I believe the designer decided to split the Western Front. And remember that fronts are the terms that the Soviets used to denote the equivalent of army groups. So the designer, I believe, split the Western Front into 2 formations, and that's because of the size of it. It is the most substantial of the fronts. And why? Because it's commanded by Georgy Shukov, the whole thing. So when you think in game terms, you see 2 formations, but it's basically just one big Russian front. Here we see the situation with the right side of the Western Front pushing towards Gazatsk, and the Germans holding fast with their 9th Army. How long can they hold, for example, that important city of Rezev? Well, it depends, I guess, on the stay of the First Shock Army. It will stay for this turn, so that means that Soviets will lose a 2nd victory point, but this may be the last turn for the First Shock Army. It'll have to withdraw. And we see here the forces of the Kalinin front in brown. The 9th Army has withdrawn to a more solid defense line. And here in the north, we see the N, I believe, means the Northwest Front. And it's facing units of the R formation here. I believe it will be reserve formation. Those are the ones with the purple stripe. They have retreated to a more defensible line. And that is the situation at the beginning of the Soviet movement phase for turn 5. So the Soviets spend their first activation to activate the WL, or left side of the Western Front, for movement. And the Soviets in this part of the front are bent on capturing Kirov, which is not worth any victory points, but it is a city across the river, and also bent on destroying, or at least pushing back, that Panzer Grenadier unit. So these are the positions before movement, and here are the positions after movement, and we will be seeing 2 attacks here on this 18th Panzer Division defending Kirov and the 10th Panzer Grenadier Division. The rest of the units in this formation are holding what's becoming a stretched line. Now, turning our attention to the sector held, or of the sector under the responsibility of the WR front, the right part of the Western Front, we see that the Germans have retreated behind this river here, and they hold the city of Gazatsk, and all these units are stacked to the maximum, or at least 2 units. The Germans can stack 3 units maximum, the Soviets 2, but they are behind rivers, so they are in pretty solid defensive formations with a few exceptions, like this lone infantry division here. So breaking the line in this sector is going to be difficult. So we may see the WR front making this time another push for Rezev. In this case, Rezev is held by one infantry division, which can be attacked from these two hexes. So these are the positions of the WR front before movement, but first let's spend the activation point. So a second Russian activation point is spent to move the WR front. So these are the positions before movement, and here we see the positions after movement. There will be an aggressive attack against the Germans holding Gazatsk. Here we have 6 plus 13, it's 19 combat factors against 6, so that's a 3-to-1, but with a -2 die roll modifier, so that's a pretty risky attack. But the Soviets have to start taking some risks and try to punch some holes in the German line. And further north is the attack against Rezev, but we will see units of the WR front attacking these two hexes here, and the Bryansk front will have an attack made by its units, maybe one of the units from the WR front also on Rezev, but that's when we activate the Kalinin front. I said Bryansk, I meant Kalinin front, and that's the next front that will be activated. So the Soviets use their third activation point to activate the Kalinin front for movement. We see the forces of the Kalinin front. A substantial number of units had been busy here wiping out two surrounded German divisions, so they will join the action on the front, and we will see Kalinin front units swarming these German units trying to get across the river and helping out in the attack on Rezev. So these are the positions of the Kalinin front units before movement, and here are the positions after movement. The Kalinin front units are crossing the river here in force, and maybe we'll see some risky attacks here designed to punch a substantial hole in the line of the 9th Army, which has been pretty stable in this game and has held the line so far. Let's turn our attention now to the northern part of the map, where we have the Northwest Front facing some German divisions that are trying to plug the line here. So the Soviets spend a fourth activation point to activate the units of the Northwestern Front for movement. Here we see the units of the Northwestern Front include 3 breakthrough units, which are the ones in dark brown, which can advance under certain circumstances 2 hexes instead of 1. So let's see if this is one of those situations. These are the positions before movement. We see the positions after movement. We'll see 2 attacks here if the Soviets have enough activation points. On these 2 units, this unit from the 34th Army is being hard pressed to hold a substantial portion of the front, so that may be a weakness there in the line. Now, the Soviets have 3 activation points left, and that would serve to activate the both formations of the Western Front and that Northwestern Front, but there is a huge gap here between the units of the Bryansk Front and the WL Front, and it's too dangerous to leave it unattended. So we will activate the Bryansk Front for movement. Soviets use their 5th activation point to activate the Bryansk Front for movement. In this game, the Bryansk Front has only 5 units, and they are tasked with protecting the left flank of the WL Front. So it's time for them to move. These are the positions after movement, and they've plugged that gap to the south of Sukhinichi. And that's the end of the Soviet movement phase. On to the Soviet combat phase. So a tough decision for the Soviets now. They have only 2 activation points left. They had units placed for attacks here around Kirov by the WL front, And of course, the important attacks try to capture Rezev and maybe even Gzatsk by the WR front. That attack on Rezev is being supported by the Kalinin front. So right there would be 3 activation points to activate both Western Front formations and the Kalinin front, but the Soviets only have 2. So the Soviets will use their activation points, 1 to activate the Western Front for attack, and the last one to activate the Kalinin front also for attack. And you can assign activation points freely in this game. So now we will resolve attacks with the Western Front and the Kalinin front. That means no attacks by the WL front, and we move to the sector of the WR front, where we have an important attack on Gzatsk, held by 2 panzer units. This is a 3-to-1 attack. The defenders are in a city, so that's a -1 die roll modifier, and all the attackers are across a river, so it's a -2. So this is a risky 3-to-1 attack. We roll 1d6. The roll is a 3 modified to a 1 contact, so nothing happens, and this obviously isn't what the Soviets wanted. And Gzatsk remains in German hands for now. So now we move further north, and we see various possibilities. And as I stated before, the attacks don't have to be pre-designated. But let's see how the more important attacks fare. And we start with the attacks against the 9th Army here. We see that the 1st Shock Army has a strength of 20. It can attack both German units across the river. That would be a 2-to-1 attack, so it will need assistance by other units. The 2 units immediately to the south of the 1st Shock Army provide 9 combat factors, so it's 29 to 8. That's 3-to-1 across a river. That's a -1. So the 4-8 unit will join in. So it's now 29 plus 4, 33 between 8. That's 4-to-1 with a -1. And we roll 1d6. And the result is a 4 modified to a 3. Defender retreats 2 hexes. And again, in this game, the attacker retreats the defending unit. So both units now retreat 2 hexes and are flipped to their disrupted sides. And now the Soviets advance. They can only advance into the vacated hex. And note that the breakthrough unit, that 4-8, which could advance another hex, cannot do so because there are other units exerting enemy zones of control. So now we proceed to solve the attack on Rezev. And this is an attack by forces of the WR and the Kalinin front. The Soviets have 15 factors, the Germans 4. 15 to 4, 3-to-1, but the Germans have defenders in a city, so that's a -1. We roll 1d6. The result is a 5 modified to a 4. The defenders retreat 2 hexes, and they are disrupted. Soviets advance into Rezev. That deprives the Germans of 3 victory points. Now I noticed that I forgot to move these Kalinin front units. They should have moved. And of course, now that I know the result, the victorious combat results, what I'll do is I'll move them half of their movement allowance, just to partially correct the mistake. My bad. But that's now the end of that attack. There's still some possible attacks by units of the Kalinin front. Let's take a look at them. And there is this next attack here. These 2 stacks, 12 combat factors, attacking across a river and in wooded terrain. So these are the type of attacks that normally the Soviets probably wouldn't make. It's a 3-to-1 attack with a -2 die roll modifier. The result is a 4 modified to a 2. Defender retreats 1 hex. So the sole defending unit is retreated 1 hex and is flipped to its disrupted side. And now the Soviets can advance. And the 15 minutes are up, and we continue with the conclusion of the Soviet combat phase in the next video.